Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to take a minute for introductions. My name is Christine Lowe, and I'm the Director of Disability Services at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. And this is my friend and colleague, Marie.
Hi, my name is Marie Lusk, and I'm the Director for the Office of Student Accessibility Services at Rush University in Chicago.
Today, we'll be discussing applying for accommodations for the United States Medical Licensing Examinations, or USMLE step exams. There are a lot of board exams in differing medical programs, nursing, OT, PT, and also outside of the US. But this talk will focus on the USMLE.
This video will address the following topics. The USMLE step exams. What are they? How do they function? What are your institutional policies relating to these step exams? The timeline for applying for step exams. Christine and I will share with you both of our layouts at each of our institutions. What forms does the student need to complete? What documentation needs to be submitted? Personal statements, the additional burden of applying for accommodations, such as requiring additional information, getting approved and/or denied, and we will end with sharing vignettes with you to work through to put some of these principles into action.
There are 3 step exams, usually taken in order, but step 1 and step 2 can be reversed. Step 3 is typically taken after students complete their first year of residency. Today, we will focus on step 1 and step 2, clinical knowledge or CK exams. Understanding the exam format is the first step for the DSP and the student. You cannot effectively apply for accommodations unless you can tie a disability-related functional limitation to a barrier in the standard format of the exam. All the information about the standard format of the step exam can be found on the USMLE website. So one of the first things I do is direct students to look at the site to familiarize themselves with the standard format so they can be thoughtful about what types of accommodations they might need. We've included the link for the USMLE on this slide. We have taken this information directly from the USMLE website, which lists in detail the format of the exams, including the time frame, when breaks are issued, how much break time is given. So, for example, medical students will need to complete 7 blocks divided into 7 60-minute sessions for a total of 8 hours for their step 1 exam.
Step 2, clinical knowledge or CK, is again a 1-day, but 8 60-minute blocks administered over 9 hours of testing with built-in break time. The number of questions per block on a given examination will vary, but will not exceed 40. The examination will also include a minimum allotment of 45 minutes of break time. Again, we've listed the website here for the USMLE accommodation site. The step accommodation application process is time-consuming and is something that non-accommodated students do not have to pursue. One element that will determine the time frame to apply for accommodations relates to the institutional policies. Are step exams a progression or a graduation requirement? In addition, when are students expected to test? Are there dedicated study periods built into the curriculum? For example, at Rush University, our step exams are progressional, meaning Rush students must take step 1 after their M2 year and cannot progress to their 3rd year clerkship experience without passing the exam.
At Sinai, step 1 and step 2 CK became graduation requirements during COVID, meaning the students must schedule to take their exams and pass them prior to receiving their diploma. Students are now all over the map in terms of when they choose to test. Some still take step 1 the summer after year 2, which was the timing before COVID. Others postpone for various reasons. Some wait and take step 1 and step 2 CK back to back after 3rd year while they're on scholarly year. We have also had some students reverse the order and take step 2 before taking step 1. Once you know when your students will be testing, you can create an application timeline for the students. This is the timeline that I use with students. I recommend starting the application process 10 months before students want to test. I suggest that students start the summer after first year because at Icon, that's when they have the most time in their schedule. And so it allows them to do a variety of things like gather historical documentation from home if needed, all those old 504s and IEPs, get new documentation of accommodations, and put together all the accommodation documentations they had from previous standardized exams like the SAT or the MCAT. Again, it gives time to get new or additional documentation. For instance, if they need new neuropsych testing, which can be really time consuming, it gives them time to write their personal statements and edit, and then send the packet in. If they do this early fall, they beat the rush of applications and they can have a faster turnaround time. And if they're denied, we have time to start the appeal process without them feeling the pressure to test. I always tell students it's worth their time to put the best packet together the first time.
My timeline mirrors Christine's with a few little modifications. If a student reaches out to me after they are accepted or prior to even medical school starting, I will start the discussion about accommodations in medical school and bring up board exams with them at that time. I inform students upon admissions or as soon as they connect with my office, if they are seeking accommodations for the exam setting, we really need to have a robust discussion about the STEP exams. It is ideal to reach students early so they can start gathering all historical diagnostic documentation that they can. This means contacting their primary schools, their secondary schools, post-bac, speaking to their parents or guardians for any documentation that they may still have in their possessions. Get all the documentation that they can. Fun fact, some school districts will house documentation for up to 17 years. So a student can most likely contact their school district to see if there's anything still on file for them to review. So my timeline, as you can see here, I like to discuss with my students if they're in their first year admissions through their M1 year. We're going to talk about the process and create a checklist and strategize their timeline. My goal with the students is really just the documentation, gathering during this first time, and then really in between the summer between M1 and M2 is really when I want to work with them to revise and edit their personal statements. We want to review their diagnostic documentation. And then at our institution in September of their M2 year, so it's like the first 2 or 3 weeks of our semester, our students are allowed to apply for their NBME ID number. So once they have the ID number, they can submit all of their documentation versus waiting for this time of the year and then starting this whole process. So it's my students from admissions through the fall of M2, I tell them to spread out the workload of getting documentation, getting reevaluated if they need to. We can edit, we can work with their providers on editing the letters if we need to during this time. So our goal is we spread it out over this time period. So when they're eligible to apply, they have everything in a folder to attach in the email to send for their accommodation request. Then they can submit their request in the fall of their M2 year, and then we wait. We generally start getting responses if my students submit end of September, early October. We generally hear things before the end of the calendar year or early into January. If they're approved, my students reserve their testing and time location. If they are denied, we still have some time to craft an appeal decision if needed and or have that discussion of do they want to apply for that denial. And if they choose to, we go through the process. We do our best to get updated documentation, resubmit, await the response of the appeal, and if it comes back, reserve their new testing at their location and take step one. And again, it varies by student, but it's nice that I can tell them with this strategy, it's breaking up this work into smaller pieces because our students are so busy. This is another thing that takes away from their studies and personal time. So we really want to make sure we can budget this along the way so it's not so overwhelming.
So what forms are required? By visiting the USMLE website, you'll be able to review in detail what a student must submit as part of a complete packet. There are 3 basic forms: the new request form, the subsequent request form, and request for additional break time. Let's discuss a new step 1 request.
The new request form will ask for basic demographic information on the first page and for the student's USMLE ID number. Show the students the box at the bottom of page 1. It includes a list of the required packet's elements. The student must check off which exam they are seeking for an accommodation, step 1, step 2 CK, or step 3, and what type of accommodation they are seeking, such as additional break time over one day and or additional time. The rest of the application asks about dates of diagnoses and diagnosis codes, and the history of approved accommodations in K through 12, undergraduate, post-bac, university level work, and or any and all entrance exams such as the ACT, SAT, GRE, MCAT. The final page lists how to submit the application electronically.
The subsequent request form is used if a student is approved for accommodations on a step exam, usually step 1, and plans to utilize the same accommodations for a subsequent step exam. They complete the request form and send it in. This does not require any additional documentation or other materials, and I've never seen a student get denied under these conditions. This is also the form to use if the request is for a new or different accommodation due to a change in the nature or extent of a student's disability. They complete this form and provide information. I would suggest a new personal statement to describe what's changed and new supporting documentation from providers to support the new request.
The additional break time request form is ideal for our students who may need to use the bathroom more frequently or need to step away to monitor their health during the exam. However, some students with these same conditions do apply for the time and 1/2 over 2 days. Speaking with the student to determine which option is best for them and their health is crucial. Also consider, what are the approved accommodations in medical school? Does it align with the NBME request?
Let's talk about PIEs. It's really helpful to familiarize yourself with what's on the personal item exemptions for PIEs list. It includes earbuds, hearing aids, canes, slings and casts, wheelchairs, catheters, insulin pumps, CGM, and receiver. One note is that you cannot use a smartphone app. No request or form is needed, as the list contains what's permitted, but I do recommend that students print the list and highlight the item they're using and bring the list with them to the testing center. Inform the students that devices or medical equipment are subject to inspection by test center staff. If a student needs an item not on the list, email disabilityservices@nbme.org to inquire. They can provide information for you and the student. It usually just requires documentation from a provider along with a photo of the item that's needed. And again, a note is that you can't use a stock photo. It actually has to be a photo of the student's device.
The certification or prior test accommodations, this is the form the DRP has to complete for the student. It's simple and does not take up much time. However, be mindful of what you add in the area asking why you approve the accommodation. If you can fit your response on the lines provided, great. If the case is more complex, maybe due to multiple diagnoses, extensive documentation, or lack of historical documentation, consider writing a one-page letter of support to accompany this certification form. I have at times completed this form, and instead of writing a reason for the approval, I wrote, "See accompanying letter of support." In this letter, I'll document the process I went through to approve this student's accommodation. I will highlight the information that was shared with me from the student's report and their clinicians and their diagnostic documentation to ensure the information aligns with the request and the requirements of the USMLE.
Documentation is a critical component of the application package. Inform your students to get as much documentation as they can from as far back as possible. All those old IEPs and 504s, letters detailing accommodations in undergrad, letters about accommodations on previous standardized exams like the SAT or the MCAT, and previous neuropsych evaluations. It's helpful to review the general guidelines on the USMLE website. Then, based on the student's disability, you can look at the guidelines for specific impairments, such as specific learning disorders, ADHD, visual impairments, hearing impairments, and psychiatric disorders. I suggest that students cut and paste the info from those guidelines into an email to their providers, or paste a link to this on the website. Most providers seem surprised by the level of detail required, though being specific with the provider about what's needed up front is important and saves time going back and forth to get additional information documented. I inform students that if they submit documentation that is incomplete, they'll either just get denied or the USMLE will respond that they need additional information before rendering a decision on the application.
If the documentation does not specifically highlight the functional limitation of the disability in multiple domains, requests are not normally approved. So you may have to review all of the historical documentation to highlight these functional limitations so the student can reference them in their personal statement. And this review will also provide you with the opportunity to review the diagnostic documentation for any discrepancies in evaluations. For example, if providers contradict each other across time with regard to diagnosis, that needs to be addressed. It's best if this can be remedied before sending the documentation. If that's not possible, it can be addressed in the personal statement. Don't send them things they do not want them to see, such as the MCAT score. It is not required to send it. The reasoning is the student got into medical school, and that score may be the reason the USMLE denies the request and as the student scored well on the MCAT. Language used by providers in the documentation needs to be strong and clear that the student's diagnosis meets the ADA requirement of a substantial limitation in a major life activity and qualifies the student as disabled and therefore protected under the law and entitled to accommodations. Phrases such as "it would be helpful" or "ensure the student's success" must be avoided. Instead, use phrases such as "the provision of the requested accommodations for student's name on USMLE STEP exams is critical to providing them with access to the testing material that is equal to that of their non-disabled peers, allowing student's name to demonstrate their actual knowledge." Providers also highlight examples of functional limitations associated with the disability across multiple domains, not just standardized testing.
Professors students that this is not a document written from a strength-based perspective. This can be really challenging for students who are used to putting their best foot forward, and it's not a place to highlight accomplishments. This is a time to highlight challenges or barriers, which many students have never done. Provide a written statement describing the disability for which you are requesting accommodations. I tell students this isn't a time to reiterate everything written in your documentation. This is a time for the student to share their lived experience. Include specific information about the disability-related symptoms and how they affect daily functioning. Prompt your students to use multiple domains, like examples from their social or personal life, their work life, financial life, etc. I tell my students if you're using 3 examples in the document, make 1 academic and 2 from other domains. If you're going to use 4 examples in your document, make it 2 and 2. Sample prompts can be found in the book Equal Access for Students with Disabilities, the Guide for Health Science and Professional Education. Describe the extent to which your daily functioning is impaired and how that impairment interferes with your ability to access the examination under standard conditions. That's critically important. Provide a clear rationale for the requested accommodations and describe how each requested accommodation will alleviate the functional limitations caused by your disability. And again, avoid those language pitfalls. Make sure you're using strong language. For example, based on my documented disability diagnosis and associated functional limitations described above, I require the following accommodations.
We wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the emotional toll this application takes on our students and us. This is a time-consuming process. DRPs can average 10 to 20 hours for each STEP application. That is a lot of time, but for our students, this is time that they are taking away from their studies and or their leisure time. Praise their commitment to this process. Also, have a frank discussion about if they want to use this time for the application process or in some other way if they're unlikely to get approved. Be transparent and frank with the student. The idea is not to discourage someone from applying, but rather to give them the benefit of your expertise so they can make an informed decision. Acknowledge that this is something their non-accommodated peers do not have to do, and discuss through your timeline where to find time to work on this application. Help them to stay organized and motivated. Finally, and this is my personal approach, I tell them we hope for the best, but we plan for the worst, meaning we have to have an honest discussion about being denied the request and making alternate plans, such as filing an appeal to the denial and or accepting the denial letter and preparing to test without accommodation.
We have prepared some vignettes so you can think through what we've discussed. We're going to go through two case examples. As you read the vignettes, consider what forms are required, what documentation is required, what do you as a DRP need to assist with, and potential pitfalls. So case one, this is an M1 student who's already registered with your office. This student has approved custom accommodations for medical school since the student enrolled. They have time in 1/2 for all written portion of exams and quizzes in a reduced distraction environment. The student was diagnosed with ADHD at age 5, has historical documentation dating back through early childhood, all the way through undergraduate. They received time and a half for the SAT and the MCAT. Now, stop the recording for a minute so you have time to think through what's needed for this student. So let's review our suggestions for case one. What forms are required? We would suggest the new request form, a certification of prior test accommodations. In terms of documentation, everything. The early intervention documentation, IEPs, 504s, education plans, kindergarten to 12th grade, neuropsychological or psychoeducational evaluations that have been done throughout the years, approved accommodation letters from the college or university that was attended, approval letters for accommodations on the SAT and the MCAT, and a personal statement written by the student. What do you as a DRP need to assist with? Maybe review the USMLE website with your students, review their request form to ensure they're checking all the correct boxes and they've filled out all the correct diagnoses and ICD codes or DSM codes, how and where to send the packet. I often offer to review personal statements and help students edit them, provide them with prompts, and potential pitfalls. Remember that language matters. So reviewing for language can be helpful. Make sure that you've met all the required guidelines as explained in the application instructions, and make sure there's no conflicting information in the documentation that's being provided.
In this case, we have an M2 or M3 who wishes to apply for a Step 2 CK and did not apply for Step 1 as they are diagnosed in medical school. This individual was diagnosed with a specific learning disorder with an impairment in reading and general anxiety disorder. Since engaging the DRP office, the student has been approved for the following: time in 1/2 for all written exams, audio version of the exams are made available, excused absences for medical appointments, alternate formative materials, and this student did pass Step 1 but with a low score. This student is requesting time in 1/2, additional break time, and audio rendition of the exam.
We recommend the new request form, the certification of prior accommodations, a personal statement, and the documentation for both diagnoses. It would also be helpful to review the personal statement and documentation for potential pitfalls. Use of language and any contradictory statements between or within documentation or amongst providers needs to be addressed in the personal statement, and an explanation related to the late diagnosis and implementation and usage of accommodations in medical school.
Finally, we wanted to share some resources and support. We have some text to recommend: Equal Access for Students with Disabilities, the second edition for Equal Access for Students with Disabilities, the Guide for Health Science and Professional Education, the HSM Coalition Listserv, a HEADS Listserv, and of course the USMLE accommodation information on their website. That link will take you directly there. And again, peers at other medical colleges. Getting in touch with other disability resource providers can help you better understand and strategize what can work best for your students. It is a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. It may seem extremely frustrating, but we have to remember to be with the student, help them through this, and empower them to make the best decision and guide them to get the best application in for their accommodation request. Thank you again. Have a good day.